Okay, so as Melissa mentioned, I work in the area of film studies, and about, 2-3 weeks ago, I gave a paper at a film conference on the film conference. The theme was animals and the non-human, and I faced a couple of challenges there because I was talking to an audience, a film studies audience, for whom the question of the animal was a relative novelty. And the two challenges were, first, how to convey the fundamental shift that takes place within the discipline when animals are brought into the mix. And second, how to convey the sense of importance, even urgency, both sort of conceptual but also emotional, the sense of urgency that has brought animals into the mix in the first place. This afternoon, this evening, I'm speaking to a different kind of audience, so all of you come from a diverse range of disciplines, and the question of the animal is something that you totally get, obviously, but I'm not sure that everyone here is familiar with the discipline of film studies. So the mode of address is a little bit different, I guess. So I'm going to try, I think, today, I hope to be able to show what the so-called animal turn in film studies is about and why it matters. And I should say right away that the reason it matters, the reason film and animals matters, I think, is because cinema is one cultural practice among others, and it's embedded in other kinds of practices, economic, political, social, ethical, and so forth. It's in that world, and so although it has its own medium specificity, film cannot be considered in isolation from the wider context that impact on animals in profound and decisive ways. So my take on cinema generally is that it's one biopolitical apparatus among others, and therefore I think about cinema less as a representational medium and more as a kind of machine that captures, frames, and processes all of these and exposes animals in various ways.
Anat, could you speak up?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So, okay, I'll begin. Sorry. That should be a little bit better. Okay. Oh yeah, that sounds good. So, okay, so this year sees the joint 40th anniversaries of two seminal works in film. The first is Laura Mulvey's essay that many of you probably have heard of, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. And the second is Steven Spielberg's blockbuster Jaws. Both are celebrating their 40th anniversary this year. Mulvey's essay pointed to the ways in which women in Hollywood film are positioned as objects of what she called famously the male gaze, a gaze that consumes women as spectacle and reinforces the division between active male and passive female. The act of looking in film, Mulvey showed, is fundamentally imbued with questions of subjectivity and power. And I quote, she says, "In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact so that they can be said to connote to be looked atness." Visual pleasure emerged out of the ferment of second-wave feminism and the ideological critiques of the 1970s, the leftist critiques of the 1970s, a time which also saw the publication of the influential work on looking, images, and ideology by the novelist, critic, and essayist John Berger, who I'm sure many of you know. In one of his most celebrated essays, Why Look at Animals?, published in 1980, but it's actually an essay that is a compilation, in fact, of earlier essays on animals. So Mulvey and Berger were working at the same time in the mid to late 70s, although the essay itself came out in 1980. So in 1980, he published Why Look at Animals? And in that essay, Berger writes, and I quote, this is quite a famous passage, he says, "Animals are always the observed. The fact that they can observe us has lost all significance. They're the objects of our ever-extending knowledge. What we know about them is an index of our power, and thus an index of what separates us from them." Berger's central claim in this essay is that capitalism has gradually eroded the intimate connection between humans and animals. In place of mutual looking, animals become the passive objects of the look. Modernity, he explains, saw the removal of animals from daily life. And we kind of talked about that, both in, it came up in Erica's lecture, and of course in Timothy's work is about the removal of animals from immediate visibility in daily life. As animals vanished into industrialized farms and died out in the wild, they resurfaced as images. This is Berger's argument. Genuine encounters with animals were replaced by carefully managed, heavily mediated ones. The zoo is one such manufactured encounter that falls short of the real thing. And this is Berger. He says, the zoo to which people go to meet animals, to observe them, to see them, is in fact a monument of the impossibility of such encounters. And like zoos, he continues, realistic animal toys and widespread commercial diffusion of animal imagery all began as animals started to be withdrawn from daily life. There are many, as you'll see, there are many problems with his characterization of modernity, of animals, of images, but it's a fundamental, sort of a key text in film studies and animal film studies, as it were. And it influenced other key texts on the visual animal, most notably, I think, Akira Mizuta Lippitt's Electric Animal, which came out in 2000, and Jonathan Burt's Animals in Film, which came out in 2002. Each in his own way, Lippitt and Burt respond to Berger's stark claim towards the end of the essay that, quote, everywhere animals disappear. For Lippitt, this active disappearance is virtually synonymous with the medium of cinema, and so he sees animals as circulating spectrally, continuously as images, and that is essentially his understanding of cinema, is this kind of spectral loop in which animals are caught, undying, reanimated again and again and again, but immaterial somehow. So these are the two bits. Now, the affinities between Mulvey's critique of women's images and Berger's critique of animal images are clear, and we can recognize them in my title, the still image from Jaws 2, which was made in 1978. A young woman, scantily clad, in a state of mortal peril, shuts her eyes in order not to look at the animal she knows is there and might shortly devour her. There are hierarchies and intersections in this image. The woman's bare shoulders and the shark's oversized fin available to our gaze from the safety of our seats. Objectification here oscillates between the ocular and the oral, between being looked at, as Mulvey said, and being eaten. And my understanding of being eaten is a particular kind of objectification that is a sort of holistic form of violent appropriation, to be eaten. Now, of course, the horror film makes humans and especially women, of course, momentarily edible. That's kind of what the horror film is often about. Film animals, on the other hand, are routinely made edible. And this is true not only of animal films, which are mainly the films that we're talking about here, but also in any other kind of film. So they crop up in just films in general as food, as part of the furniture, as part of the even materiality of the cinematic apparatus itself, of the film stock, pre-digital cinema. So here you've got an image from Pulp Fiction, the milkshake, which came up in, I think, the previous session when we talked about milkshakes. That's Uma Thurman drinking a milkshake, and that's an image from Looper, where you have steak and chips. And so you can kind of play spot the animal when you're watching films, even if there are no animals, as it were, in the film. There are body parts of animals strewn across cinema, generally. But the reason I like the film the still from Jaws 2 is not only because of its generic parallels between a monstrous animal and a disposable female, but because the woman, in her desperate bid to ward off reality, to deny what she and we also know is kind of inevitable, that she's going to get eaten, she closes her eyes to the animal. She decides not to look at animals. So why look at animals, indeed? So back to Berger. Why look at animals? Berger's answer is that animals, quote, offer man a companionship which is different from any offered by human exchange, a companionship offered to the loneliness of man as a species. Berger is one in a long line of thinkers who regard the animal, who hold the animal in regard, as the other of man. The uncanniness of animals, the fact that they're like us but unlike us, is for Berger a kind of existential exercise by which his own identity as a human being is confirmed. So the uncanniness of the animal, a little bit like the Lacanian mirror phase, constitutes human identity. Who are we? We are not animals. And because looking at animals is an existential activity for him, he's very concerned with the rupturing of that relationship under industrial capitalism. And so for him, capitalism threatens human identity, basically, and calls for some kind of reparation or recuperation of that undisturbed relationship between the human and the animal that existed supposedly before capitalism. Now, as I said before, there are quite a few problems with this way of thinking about the human-animal encounter, not least in Berger's use of the very gendered dualism of man and animal. He's always talking about man and animal. There's no attention in his text to either human women or female animals, and as you'll see, he's interested in agriculture, and his overlooking of the question of female animals, particularly in the agricultural context, is quite a significant omission on his part. But there are also problems with his notion of images, as we'll talk about in a bit, and his historicization of modernity is also problematic. So there are problems all around. Nevertheless, as I said, he's an important, he offers an important foundation for thinking about a visual animal, which is why I'm taking the time to discuss him. Another problem with Berger is that the possibility that animals may not want to be looked at, or that in turn we may not have the right to look at them, or we may wish to look differently at them, these possibilities are unthinkable in Berger's constellation. In a recent piece that I wrote for an issue of Nexus that Barbara Creed edited, called Why Not Look at Animals, I posit the possibility of not seeing animals as a kind of alternative modality of sight, an alternative to this constant looking that Berger doesn't question. Now, by not seeing animals, I'm not advocating an end to animal imagery. This isn't about abolishing animal imagery. I am interested in altering the optics of the human-animal encounter and in undermining the impulse to make animals visible unconditionally. In the documentary Bear 71 that I'm going to discuss later on, not seeing corresponds to the demands of animal privacy that denies human eyes and their technological proxies unlimited access to animals' lives. Not seeing is also part of a larger project that I'm calling, a little polemically, vegan cinema, which, to define very, very concisely, a cinema that approaches the vulnerable objects of the gaze without devouring them. A cinema that lets beings be. Now that a gaze can be devouring, that we can describe a gaze as devouring, takes us back to this analogy between looking and eating, an analogy that appears in the work of the French philosopher, who Melissa mentioned in her introduction, Simone Weil, whose thoughts on looking, eating, and letting be I find very potentially enriching and challenging for cinema. Weil doesn't really write about cinema, but it makes it even more interesting to try and take some of her work and see what happens when you apply it or think about it in relation to the cinematic medium. So the route that I'm going to be taking here is a little bit winding. I'm going to begin with a close look at John Berger's work, by way of a number of film examples that relate to what he's saying about looking at animals. And then I'm going to end on a more speculative note by thinking about Simone Weil and vegan cinema. One passage in particular reveals Berger's investment in the authentic encounter between humans and animals. The relationship between a peasant and his pig is marked by the coexistence of affection and violence. There we are. That strikes the city dweller as paradoxical. And Berger writes, again, this is a famous passage, he says, "A peasant becomes fond of his pig and is glad to salt away its pork." What is significant and is so difficult for the urban stranger to understand is that the two statements in this sentence are connected by an and not by a but. As Jonathan Burt explains, the killing of animals is not in itself problematic, providing it is done in a world in which an intimacy exists between man and animal. This is good killing, and it is contrasted with the attitude of modern alienated man. Intimacy is achieved, and I think even perhaps fulfilled, in the act of killing. Like the production of images, this act of killing presupposes unlimited access to animals. And so here I see a similarity between violence and looking that simply takes for granted the fact that animals are there for the taking. The relation is made good by the sheer fact of contact as a remedy for alienation. Berger has written widely and movingly about peasants. His 1979 collection, Pig Earth, opens with a 4-page graphic description of the slaughtering of a spent dairy cow at a small family farm. After being stunned, the cow's, and I quote, "the cow's legs fold and her body collapses instantaneously." And then he continues and says, "When a viaduct breaks, its masonry, seen from a distance, appears to fall slowly in the valley below, but the cow came down as fast as lightning. It was not cement which held together her body, but energy." So when I was thinking about this passage with the viaduct and the cow, I came across a piece of newsreel footage from 1969 that actually contains both a viaduct and a cow, or a number of cows. And I have no idea whether Berger saw this piece of footage, and I don't think it's particularly relevant, but his description, and this is why I think it works, it's kind of cool with this clip, as I'll show you in a minute. His description is very cinematic because it's kind of conveys the cinematic fascination with capturing emotion, and not just capturing any kind of emotion, but the cinematic fascination with the buckling, the collapsing, the destructive motion of things falling down. And two obvious examples are the early Lumiere brothers film Demolition of a Wall from 1896, where you just see two workers in the Lumiere factory demolishing a wall, and that film used to be then played backwards to reconstitute the wall. And the second example is the example that is actually included in the little short film program that I'm showing here, and that's Electrocuting an Elephant from 1903 by Thomas Edison, where the collapsing is not a wall but an elephant. So cinema is sort of interested in different materialities, beings and things that are falling down, that are collapsing, and that are being destroyed. I'll show you the footage and then make a little comment on it. So the cows ran as their viaduct crumbled, and it's very lighthearted, but I don't think it's as kind of harmless as it seems, because who are these cows and what is their fate? Their fate is the same fate as the viaduct, which returns me to the Berger passage. So these cows, given mock ownership over the exploded viaduct, they too are human property designated for destruction. Now this passage about the viaduct in Berger is followed by a detailed description of the cows processing into meat. The farmer's son, writes Berger, severs and twists off the 4 hooves and throws them into a wheelbarrow. The mother removed the udder. Then, through the cut hide, the son axes the breastbone. This is similar to the last axing of a tree before it falls, for from that moment onwards, the cow, no longer an animal, is transformed into meat, just as the tree is transformed into timber. end quote. With its forensic yet lyrical attention to detail, Berger's essay stands alongside cinema's best-known depiction of slaughter, Georges Franju's surrealist masterpiece, Blood of the Beasts, from 1949. And Blood of the Beast similarly has a kind of repeats that same buckling gesture of early on of a stunned white horse. In fact, that's the first animal that we see slaughtered in the film. I don't have time to show you, but this is just a screen grab of the buckling white horse. So again, that interest, the formal aesthetic interest in something collapsing and falling. Now, although the documentary thrust of Berger's passage gives way to stylized similes, so the horse, this is similar to the last axing of a tree, aestheticism is not Berger's primary goal, or it's not his primary interest. Labor is. And writing for Berger is also a form of labor. Like agricultural labor, writing is an activity by which, and I quote Berger, by which intimacy with the experience increases. There's a difficulty, I think, with Berger's use of peasants as figures of the uninterrupted human-animal relation. As I said before, killing animals is not a problem as long as the relation is intimate. That's a word that comes up again and again in Berger. That is the product of artisanal labor. Intimacy redeems instrumental relations between humans and animals, in which animals are, without question, without questioning, always the losers. Now, Berger, a Marxist humanist of sorts, might seem out of place in the context of posthumanist theory and posthumanist film, but the privileging of modes of intimate contact between humans and animals are at the heart of the work of leading relational posthumanists, like, of course, Donna Haraway, but also Kelly Oliver, Kathy Rudy, Sarah Franklin, Jane Bennett, and others. Relational ontology is concerned with the entanglements and what Haraway calls mess-making of humans, animals, and other materialities in, quote, multi-species contact zones. That's Haraway, of course. Despite their differences, both Berger and relational theory, I would argue, situate their truth in moments of intimate contact. Berger describes a farmer who, quote, sat on a milking stool in the dark. With his head in his hands, his breathing was indistinguishable from that of cows. The stable itself was like the inside of an animal. Breath, water, cud were entering it. Wind, piss, shit were leaving. So, the stable, the cows, the farmer, bodily fluids, air and breath comprise an assemblage of material flows, an interactive network of forces in a production line whose raw material is the animal. I'm reminded here of the striking images in Lucien Casting-Taylor and Verena Paravel's film Leviathan, which came out in 2012, in which boat, water, nets, chains, hooks, fish, and fishermen form a semi-living machine. Now, many of you probably have seen Leviathan, but in case you haven't, Leviathan is an experimental ethnographic film, experimental documentary produced at the Sensory Ethnography Lab at Harvard University, shot exclusively on GoPro cameras, and shot aboard a commercial fishing trawler in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Leviathan was a surprise hit, both commercially. It did very well for a non-narrative experimental film, and it garnered many, many scholarly accolades for what some critics called, just quoting a couple of critics, they called its post-cinematic new materialist aesthetic. So I'm going to show you a clip from Leviathan, and in the interest of time, I'm going to talk over it, so I'll turn the volume down. So in Berger and Leviathan alike, the technologies of writing and filming, the pen and the GoPro, are inseparable from the vibrant assemblage. It's no stretch, I think, to consider Leviathan as a recuperation of Berger-esque looking, images of close, labored encounters between humans and animals. Like Berger's writings on vanishing agricultural traditions, Leviathan resists sentimentality, while, in my opinion, failing to reflect on the conditions of its own instrumentalization of animals. As Laura McMahon has recently argued in a biopolitical critique of the film, Leviathan converts animal death into a hypnotic aesthetic, What the agricultural and aquacultural assemblages in Berger and Leviathan obscure is the power imbalance within which relations unfold, and significantly also the reality of animal resistance that's always there in the ensemble, in the visual ensembles, in the audio-visual ensembles, I should say. And my thinking on resistance here has very much been shaped by Dinesh Waddiwell's work on resistance. And he's talking about resistance as built into the mechanisms of fishing, to the apparatus of fishing. It's not really a question of a kind of intentional agency necessarily on the part of the fish, but it's simply the kind of effort that we see in Leviathan, the effort to capture the fish and kill them, is a testament to the fact that fish don't want to get caught. And everything in the apparatus of fishing on this boat, which is what the film revolves around, is a sign of that reality of fish resistance. So resistance is built into the mechanism itself, to the machinery itself. All right, so next I'd like to briefly turn to Bear 71, a film that handles relational sites between humans, animals, and technology a little bit differently, and so avoids some of the ethical and political pitfalls that I've been discussing so far. Jeremy Mendes and Leanne Allison's interactive web documentary Bear 71, also made in 2012, examines the tense interfaces of grizzlies, humans, and wildlife surveillance technologies. Bear 71 is a relational work as well, constructing what HRAE calls nature cultural spaces, where digital technologies, nature, and species meet. Instead of converting animal life into aesthetic currency for our audiovisual consumption, however, Bear 71 casts doubt on the desire to see as a mode of interspecies contact. And it does that by repurposing and recycling animal images to reflect skeptically on the issue of animal visibility. Bear 71 is set in Banff National Park in the Canadian Rockies. It's described as a multi-user experience that allows users to navigate a digital grid recreating the park's terrain. And you can see that here, that's the grid. And you can just sort of move your cursor, your mouse on the grid and click to see various pieces of footage from the multiple trail cams in the park. The self-directed sections are interspersed with conventional narrative segments of the titular bear's life and death, from being snared, darted, collared, and tagged until her fatal collision 11 years later on one of the railway lines that crisscrossed the park, delivering goods, in particular delivering grain. And grain is important because it's spilt grain from one of the freight trains that attracts the bear to the tracks in the first place. And grain isn't something that a bear would ordinarily eat, so the grain itself is that kind of relational site that brings modern global transportation systems, agribusiness, and wildlife and humans together. With my consent, the site activates my webcam, or your webcam if you're using it, broadcasting my image on what's called a surveillance wall, so that's that image, as one tracked animal amongst others. But the film is narrated in the first person by the deceased bear, voiced by the actress Mia Kirshner, and if we have time, we can talk about the choice of Mia Kirshner, of L Word fame, those of you who know. But she's a particular kind of choice, deliberate choice for this performance. So I want to show you, the opening clip from Bear 71. From the very beginning then, visual access to the bear is not benign. Bear 71 is trapped in a conservationist panopticon, but though she cannot evade the camera's gaze, she can be misunderstood. And she says proudly, "This one hot summer afternoon, a ranger was keeping tabs on me on Johnson Lake. I was observed to sniff the rope swing, then I jumped in the water for a swim. I remember thinking, put that in your notebook. Go ahead and analyze that." Through the voiceover, then, the images we see appear to us in the form of an infringement of animal privacy, rife with political resonances. And the bear says again, "I suppose it's like most of the surveillance that goes on today. It's partly there to protect you, and partly to protect everybody else from you." The bear is clearly unconvinced by the rhetoric of safety and security, used to justify surveillance. And again, she says, think of us as refugees, I guess. There used to be grizzlies all across the Canadian Rockies, and now there aren't any, not one. The first-person narration obviously is heavily anthropomorphic, but it's not conventionally anthropomorphic. It fits more readily in the tradition of dead narrators, whose species is not really that important because they're dead. So the tradition of dead narrators we know from both literature and film, and the dead narrator is more of a narrative construct than anything else, be it human or animal. This bear is singular, not archetypal, and her singularity accrues in the wider geopolitics of Banff National Park, its historic displacement of the native Nakota people, the role of big pharma, she talks about Pfizer's, and global transports infrastructure, as I mentioned, the grain. Looking back at her fatal train accident, the bear remarks, "There's no real mystery to how accidents happen. Things that are unstoppable are a problem when you need them to stop." Like trains, mass surveillance networks intensify in a kind of ratchet effect. And I don't have time to go into the term ratchet effect, but it's a very interesting term I came across it in actually a piece about the Patriot Act, but I think one particular interesting political theorist who talks about the ratchet effect is the libertarian philosopher Robert Higgs. But what he means by ratchet effect is the tendency of power to accelerate and intensify. And so the ratcheting up of wildlife surveillance continues against the backdrop of species extinction and environmental collapse, whether or not it achieves any of its conservation objectives. Bear 71 suggests something simple but profound. We look at animals everywhere and all the time because we can, because our technology can. But capability does not an ethic make, does not a politic make either. The film takes seriously the issues of animal privacy in the networked environments in which species and apparatuses meet. Privacy matters because it places a limit on the desire to look and anticipates other, less acquisitive ways of seeing that forego the automation and acceleration of the gaze. Animal privacy suggests that we hesitate in the face of the animal. And I think that something is forged in that space of hesitation, the space of hesitation and reserve that a film like Bear 71 sort of constructs. Perhaps a more pacific relation to animals than the one we find in Berger and in Leviathan. Unlike Berger, who pursues an encounter with animals that nourishes and fortifies the human observer, right? He wants to look at animals in order to kind of confirm his own identity as a human being. Simone Weil tackles looking in the opposite way. She actively seeks to deplete her own observational powers. In Gravity and Grace, which interestingly is a posthumous work, so kind of like The Bear maybe, so posthumously Weil writes, "May I disappear in order that those things that I see may become perfect in their beauty from the very fact that they are no longer things that I see." Weil imagines vision untangled from power by a radical reframing of subjectivity. We might initially think of the camera as the perfect example of vision unmoored from the vestiges of the dominant human observer, since cameras see the world mechanically and unintentionally, as the world might see itself. In fact, the state of total, fully automated surveillance theoretically achieves this view from nowhere. But Weil's seeing of the world as if she were not there to see it strikes me as different from such myths of total cinema. And I'm using the term total cinema, which is a quote from the cinematic realist André Bazin. So he talks about the world in its own image and the myth of total cinema as this kind of total verisimilitude. What Weil is after is the obliteration, or in her terminology, the decreation of self. Weil is preoccupied with the idea of reconstituting subjectivity in order to protect the integrity of the things that are seen. Seen, as it were, beyond the purview of power, beyond the grasp of the surveying I and ego I. May I disappear in order that those things that I see may become perfect in their beauty from the very fact that there are no longer things that I see. The triple repetition of the word I at the very moment that she's trying to obliterate the I suggests to me that she's not naive. The triple repetition betrays her frustration with the intransigence of the human observer, the fact that this I actually cannot be gotten rid of. They complicates modes of subjectivity and spectatorship that consume others, acts of seeing that for her are precisely antithetical to the conservation of the object. So this gets us to vegan cinema, and sort of move towards concluding here. Vegan cinema is conservationist in the literal sense, to the extent that it concerns the preservation of the object of sight. As a critical practice, vegan cinema is geared towards the alleviation of violence that so frequently befalls animals in film. The activist impetus in a phrase like vegan cinema nudges us in the direction of ethical and political commitment. And I find Veg useful in this context because she's the exemplary philosopher activist. She worked in a factory for a year, she tried to fight in the Spanish Civil War, she was an educator, so she was constantly putting her theory into practice. She insisted on the connection between ideas and actions, between abstraction and the flesh. At the same time, she rejects simplistic forms of activism, and that's the other reason I'm using her. She rejects simple reductive messaging. She rejects exclusionary kind of identity politics. That's not the sort of activism she's interested in. At the core of vegan cinema, then, is not the message, go vegan, although, yeah, I mean, of course, we should be vegan, but that's really not very interesting or constructive. At the core of vegan cinema is what I started with, this analogy between looking and eating. So they took eating and looking to be closely related, yet separate activities. And she says the great sorrow of human life is knowing that to look and to eat are two different operations. Maybe the vices, depravities, and crimes are nearly always, or even always in their essence, attempts to eat beauty, to eat what one can only look at. Vey is pointing out something mundane about eating, that it's ingesting and destroying exteriority. Looking has similarly been theorized in feminists, and in Laura Mulvey, for instance, but in post-structuralist theory as well, as an act of mastery over the other, an incorporation of the other into the order of the same. So looking and eating are both implicated in the power dynamics between the self and the other. And eating and looking are both a form of a kind of assimilation of difference. For Vey, the beautiful is what resists digestion and assimilation. The beautiful is, like food, she says, a carnal attraction that, unlike food, and this is her again, keeps us at a distance and implies a renunciation. And she says we want to eat all the other objects of desire. The beautiful is that which we desire without wishing to eat it. We desire that it should be. Now, this has to do with her theological, mystical outlook. And in her theology, God abandoned the world to the mercilessness of natural law in order to allow the world to be. So there's a withdrawal of God that allows creation to exist. And she perceives the beauty of the world precisely in this resounding absence of God. So she agrees with the atheist that God doesn't exist and God is not in the world is empty of God. Her entire work may be said to articulate modes of relation and action that eschew the destructive workings of power, sort of mimicking the act of abdication, God's abdication, and sort of voluntary powerlessness. Unlike Nietzsche, whom Vey very much resembles but intensely disliked, Vey is a thinker for whom power is almost always corrosive. To escape the corrosions of power calls for a renunciation, and renunciation appears in her work in a number of guises. Sometimes she calls it decreation, sometimes affliction, sometimes even slavery, which she uses in a positive way, provocatively. Veganism, in its deepest sense, at least for me, is a form of life that seeks another way of eating and another way of nourishment and survival. And it's here, at the point at which the objects of our gaze are approached without being devoured, that the idea of vegan cinema emerges. Robert Mackay suggested that the corresponding movement is relevant too. Might we say, Mackay asks, that each step or movement in the approach without devouring is also an instance of a vegan becoming herself devourable? So I'd like to end with a brief note on becoming devourable, the very possibility that Berger's human-animal encounter cannot contemplate. In the essay Being Prey, Val Plumwood reflects on her near-fatal encounter with a crocodile in Kakadu National Park, and I'm sure you all know the essay. While canoeing, Plumwood was attacked by a crocodile and barely survived. Struggling to free herself from the crocodile's deadly grip, she experienced something that sounds a lot like Simone Weil, and this particular way of seeing that I quoted before, and this is Plumwood, but it could have been Weil, I think. Plumwood says, "I glimpsed the world for the first time from the outside, as a world no longer my own, an unrecognizable, bleak landscape composed of raw necessity." I had survived the crocodile attack, Plumwood continues, but not the cultural drive to represent it in terms of masculinist monster myth, the masculinist monster myth, what she calls the master narrative. And that the master narrative that denies that, quote, humans are also animals positioned in the food chain. Plumwood herself relates the master narrative to the horror film, rendered iconic in Jaws, that I started with. We can trace this master narrative in Berger's writings on animals, and despite its audiovisual antics, I think we can trace it also in Leviathan. Plumwood's encounter, on the other hand, radically shifts human subjectivity and perspective. Vegan cinema, in turn, does not simply improve animal images by representing them more humanely or by giving us kind of positive messages about animals or animal rights. Rather, it contracts the human and enacts what, following Weil, is a kind of decreation of species. To approach the world without devouring it, while reimagining oneself as devourable, is the double movement of vegan cinema, both as a filmmaking and as a critical practice. It allows us to ponder the structural ties between acts of violence and acts of looking, whose vulnerable objects are so often animals. By invoking veganism as a gesture towards the suspension of violence, cinema can give rise to things we don't see and those which have not yet come to pass. The possibility of letting be in a cinema to come. Thanks.